I am Ethan Vance, 34 years old. A few years ago, I stood in the dim, heavily shadowed corner of a massive, incredibly expensive ballroom at my own brother's wedding, listening to him publicly mock my entire life's work in front of every single person we knew. And while I was standing there holding a generic club soda and actively trying to remain completely invisible against the expensive wallpaper, my parents were parading him around the room like a prized $1 million racehorse. They laughed loudly, their chests puffed out with immense pride as my brother looked right at me. He was completely surrounded by his wealthy, arrogant friends from his corporate job, and he sneered at me. He told me I was a poor little brother still hiding in corners. At parties, he told me I was still stuck at a tiny, worthless firm while the rest of the family was building real, tangible careers. He humiliated me right there in front of hundreds of people who looked at me with nothing but raw, unfiltered pity. But there was one massive thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea that the tiny firm he was so loudly joking about had just quietly orchestrated a multi-million-dollar corporate takeover of his entire industry. And they certainly did not know that in exactly 3 minutes, the powerful, untouchable CEO they were all currently kissing up to was going to walk over, turn completely pale, drop his glass, and start calling me his boss. Now, years later, they're the ones leaving desperate, weeping voicemails on my phone, begging for a second chance. Before I tell you exactly how that glorious, earth-shattering disaster unfolded, hit that like button if you believe that true justice always finds a way to reveal itself. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to the exact moment the trap was finally sprung. The air inside the Ashworth Manor ballroom was impossibly thick. It smelled heavily of imported white lees, expensive French perfume, and the distinct metallic scent of old money. Crystal chandeliers, massive and ostentatious, dripped from the vate. Ceilings like frozen glittering waterfalls. They cast an oppressively bright, unforgiving light on the sea of wealthy guests moving below. You have to understand, this was not just a wedding. It was a loud, aggressive statement. It was a hostile declaration of the Vance family's permanent arrival into high society. The entire evening was meticulously orchestrated to celebrate its undisputed crown prince. My older brother Julian standing there, I felt like a dirty smudge on a pristine masterpiece painting. My suit was a deep, rich charcoal. It was custom tailored in London, woven from heavy English wool, and was easily the most expensive piece of clothing I had ever owned in my life. But it was designed for a boardroom where brutal corporate decisions were made, not a flamboyant ballroom. It was quiet. It was intentionally understated. And in that room, full of rented tuxedos and flashy designer gowns, quiet was the exact same thing as being completely invisible. It took my mother, Margaret, less than 5 minutes to spot me lingering near the ornate mahogany bar. Her smile was incredibly tight. It was a masterful work of social engineering that completely failed to reach her cold eyes. She glided towards me, her heavily beaded silver dress shimmering under the harsh chandelier lights. She stopped 2 feet away and scanned me from head to toe. I could physically feel the mental checklist of my endless deficiencies being aggressively ticked off in her head. She did not ask how I was doing. She immediately told me I looked tired. She adjusted my perfectly straight tie and told me I needed to mingle with the guests. She said it looked incredibly strange for a member of the immediate family to be standing completely alone in a dark corner. She told me people at the country club would talk, and she could not afford any gossip on Julian's big day. I looked at her, my face completely blank, and told her to let them talk. Her artificial smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes hardened. She leaned in close and warned me not to be difficult. She told me to grab a glass of champagne, paste a smile on my face, and try to look like I actually belong there. She did not even wait for a reply. She was already turning on her heel to enthusiastically greet the wife of some senior real estate partner. Her dazzling, completely fake smile instantly restored. I stood there, feeling the familiar, heavy, cold knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. It was a deeply ingrained feeling I had known my entire life. It was the isolating feeling of being the absolute wrong shape for the perfect puzzle my family was obsessively trying to solve. Then, cutting through the dense crowd, I saw them, Julian and his new bride, Victoria. They were the ultimate golden couple. They were laughing loudly, glowing under the attention, and accepting endless congratulations like ancient monarchs receiving tribute from their loyal subjects. I knew it was only a matter of time before he found me. Julian loved an audience, and I was his favorite prop. He swaggered over, smelling strongly of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. He slung a heavy, aggressively proprietary arm around my shoulder and announced to his large circle of groomsmen that the mysterious tech mogul had finally arrived. His tone was absolutely drenched in sarcasm. Victoria, who was undeniably beautiful, but incredibly brittle, gave a little condescending laugh. She patted Julian's chest and told him to be nice. She looked at me with deep pity and said she thought my little consulting firm was very brave. The word brave was delivered with such thick condescension. It sounded exactly like a synonym for doomed. Julian made sure his voice carried over the elegant string quartet playing in the background. He wanted the surrounding tables to hear this. He asked me if my busy schedule playing with computers was ever going to pay for a wedding like this. He swept a hand through the air to indicate the sheer, overwhelming opulence of the massive room, the towering floral arrangements, and the open bar. He told me I was still stuck at a tiny, irrelevant firm while the rest of the adults in the room were building real careers with actual salaries and massive bonuses. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I did not break eye contact. I looked at my older brother, a man who genuinely, deeply believed he had earned a luxurious life that had been entirely gift-wrapped and handed to him by our parents. I looked at his gorgeous bride, whose powerful family name and massive real estate holdings were secretly the single biggest asset on Julian's otherwise incredibly mediocre resume. I knew something they did not know. I knew that in exactly 20 minutes, his boss, the CEO of Blackwood Financial, a ruthless man named Richard Blackwood, was scheduled to arrive through those double doors, and I knew that his highly anticipated arrival would be the exact spark needed to finally ignite a decade's worth of bone-dry tinder. They looked at me and thought this was their glorious night. They had absolutely no idea it was actually mine, but to truly understand the beautiful, catastrophic explosion that was about to happen right there on the polished marble floor, you have to understand exactly what that explosion was built on. You have to go back 10 excruciating years. You have to go back to the exact day I lost $50,000 and the day I finally brutally realized my family was never, ever going to love me the way they loved him. 10 years ago, I was 24 years old. I was living in a cramped, freezing, third-floor walk-up apartment that constantly smelled of cheap instant coffee and old damp carpets. But I was not depressed. I had an idea that kept me awake at night, my brain buzzing with electric, undeniable excitement. I had designed a complex software architecture that could completely revolutionize supply chain management for large-scale retail companies. It was highly predictive. It was incredibly efficient. And if built correctly, it was going to change the entire industry. I spent 6 grueling months of my life chained to a cheap, wobbly desk. I lived entirely on generic ramen noodles and cold coffee. I sacrificed sleep, friendships, and any semblance of a normal 20s lifestyle to turn that abstract software idea into a viable ironclad business plan. I mapped out aggressive market penetration strategies. I built conservative 5-year growth projections. I calculated precise staffing requirements. I poured my absolute soul into a dense 40-page document held together by a simple, cheap blue binder. The night I presented that binder to my parents felt like the absolute most important night of my entire life. We were at their large suburban house, sitting around the polished mahogany dining table. This was the exact same table where so many of Julian's incredibly mediocre average achievements had been wildly and loudly celebrated. My father, William, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who saw the world only in black and white certainties, strict corporate hierarchies, and 6F-figure salary brackets. His face was a mask of harsh judicial skepticism before I even opened my mouth. My mother fidgeted with her linen napkin, already looking profoundly bored and annoyed that I was cutting into her evening television time. Julian lounged lazily in the doorway, a smug, punchable grin playing on his lips as he casually watched the show unfold. I was nervous, my hands actually shaking slightly, but I was deeply passionate. I spoke about predictive algorithms and data analytics. I laid out the flawless logic. I showed them the math, and then I finally got to the ask. I made it very clear I was not asking for a handout or a gift. I was asking for a formal investment. I needed a $20,000 loan to build the initial working prototype and secure our very first major corporate client. When I finished speaking and closed the blue binder, the silence in the dining room was completely deafening. Felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the house. My father cleared his throat loudly. He used that patient, incredibly weary voice of a seasoned man explaining something painfully obvious to a very slow, delusional child. He told me it was an interesting concept for a college project, perhaps, but the real world did not run on faddish, unpredictable ideas. He told me the entire tech sector was a dangerous gamble, a bubble waiting to burst. He pointed a stiff finger directly at Julian, who was still smirking in the doorway. He said Julian was in the real world, working for a prestigious firm that had been a pillar of the financial community for a century. He looked me dead in the eye, tapped my blue binder, and said my business plan was nothing but a garbage lottery ticket. My mother sighed dramatically, rubbing her temples. She said they worried about me constantly. She complained that they had invested so much money into my college fund, and for me to just throw my degree away on some silly computer game seemed like a massive, heartbreaking waste. And then she dropped the ultimate line, the phrase that had defined my entire miserable youth. She looked at me with deep disappointment and asked, "Ethan, why can't you just be more like Julian?" The meeting was officially over. My father stood up, pushed his chair back, and told me to be realistic and get a real job. I packed up my blue binder, walked out into the freezing rain, and drove back to my terrible apartment. Exactly 2 weeks later, I was scrolling through my social media feed when I saw the pictures. Julian was grinning from ear to ear, holding a glass of champagne on a luxurious first-class flight to Italy. The caption, posted proudly by my mother, read that he absolutely deserved a lavish trip to broaden his cultural horizons before he conquered the corporate world. They did not have $20,000 to invest in my actual future, but they easily had more than $30,000 in liquid cash to fund his European vacation. I slowly closed my laptop. I put the blue binder in my bottom desk drawer. I finally realized the brutal truth. They did not invest in dreams or potential. They invested in sure things, in social status and in appearances. And I was not a sure thing. I went completely underground. I took a grueling, soul-crushing generic tech job during the day just to pay my rent and buy groceries. But my real work started at 8 at night and ended at 3 o'clock in the morning. I sacrificed everything. Every single spare dollar I made was aggressively funneled into a high-yield savings account. I guarded that money like a starving wolf. Over 3 brutal, lonely years, I saved up exactly $50,000. It was my launch capital. It was my hard-earned ticket to absolute freedom. And then came the phone call. My mother called me late on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was a syrupy, perfectly calculated blend of fake maternal concern and heavy manipulation. She started by telling me Julian was miraculously on the short list for a massive vice president promotion at his financial firm, but there was a catch. To guarantee the promotion, the senior partner strongly suggested he get a fast-tracked MBA from a highly prestigious top-tier school. She sighed heavily into the phone, complaining bitterly about how incredibly expensive the tuition was. She mentioned their upcoming country club membership dues, the high property taxes on their estate, and the rising cost of living. Then she dropped the hammer. She said she knew I was frugal and never spent money on myself. She asked for my entire savings. The blood completely drained from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gripped the phone and told her that money was strictly for my company. I told her it was everything I had in the world. She immediately shifted tactics. She cooed at me, her voice dripping with toxic false sympathy. She told me to think of it as an investment in the family's legacy. She promised that Julian's new executive salary would be astronomical and he would pay me back in a matter of months with generous interest. She expertly painted me into a tight corner, making it painfully clear that if I said no, I would permanently be the selfish, jealous villain, deliberately holding back the family's golden child against every screaming, logical instinct in my body, the desperate little boy inside me who just wanted his mother to love him finally caved. I met Julian at a loud coffee shop to hand over the cashier's check. He swaggered in 20 minutes late, talking loudly on his phone about a weekend golf trip. He barely made eye contact with me as he snatched the check from the table. He glanced at the $50,000 amount, told me I was a total lifesaver, and casually promised to pay it back. He folded my entire life's work into his designer jacket pocket and spent the next 20 minutes complaining to me about his annoying HOA meetings. I thought that was the absolute worst of it. I was incredibly wrong. 6 months later, a mutual college friend posted a photo from a weekend gathering. There was Julian wearing expensive sunglasses, leaning casually against the hood of a brand new custom-ordered Porsche 911. The caption congratulated Julian on his new toy. He had not just used my money for his MBA tuition. He had used my blood, my sweat, and my endless sleepless nights to quietly finance his ridiculous, fragile ego. That $50,000 vanished into thin air. The loan was never mentioned again by anyone in the family. I was completely, utterly broken. I had absolutely nothing left. But in the Vance family portrait, there was exactly one figure who always understood me, my grandfather Benjamin. He was a master carpenter while my father built a stressful career aggressively climbing corporate ladders and stepping on people. My grandfather built solid, tangible, beautiful things with his rough, calloused hands. His dusty workshop smelled of rich cedar and warm varnish, and it was the only place on earth I ever felt truly safe. Before he passed away, his health failing rapidly, he called me to his bedside. He did not offer grand sweeping speeches. He simply reached over and gave me his old wristwatch. It was a beat-up, heavily scratched timepiece with a faded leather strap held together in one spot by a piece of black electrical tape. It was financially worthless, but to me it was priceless. He fastened it to my wrist with trembling hands. He looked me in the eye and told me to be exactly like the watch. He told me to be honest, to just do the work and to ignore the noise. His funeral was incredibly somber, but entirely fake. My father stood at the podium and gave a eulogy that was polite, but deeply tinged with a subtle, arrogant pity for my grandfather's simple working class life. It physically disgusted me to watch them use his death as a networking event, whispering about real estate and stock portfolios over his casket. After the funeral, my aunt, Evelyn, handed me a worn leather-bound notebook from his workshop. Tucked inside the pages was a yellowed piece of paper, a note he had left specifically for me. It read, "Ethan, a man's worth isn't what he has in the bank. It is what he builds. Go build something great. I believe in you." That short note and that old scratched watch were my true inheritance. I taped the note above my computer monitor. I wore the watch every single day. I took that burning violent rage, that profound sense of betrayal regarding the Porsche 911 and the stolen $50,000, and I weaponized it. I completely stopped wanting their approval. I wanted to build an absolute empire. The long years immediately following my grandfather's funeral were a relentless blur of punishing, exhausting labor. I did not just start over from scratch. I completely mutated. My dream went totally underground, buried deep out of sight from anyone who shared my last name. That little blue binder I had presented at the dining room table slowly evolved into a corporate entity called Nexus Tech, and I did not build it alone. I brought in a woman named Maya Lin to be my chief operating officer. Maya was brilliant, entirely ruthless, and the only person on earth who knew the full ugly truth about my toxic family dynamic. We started our operation with 2 incredibly cheap desks crammed into a rented, unheated garage, literally living off sheer, unadulterated spite and cheap diner food. Fast forward to the present day. Nexus Tech was no longer a scrappy, desperate startup struggling to keep the lights on. We were a massive silent giant in the industry. We had sleek glass-walled offices in 3 major cities, a staggering valuation pushing deep into the 9 figures, and a terrifying, legendary reputation in the corporate world for executing flawless, aggressive acquisitions. My daily life was a nonstop whirlwind of high stakes commercial real estate deals, massive payroll expansions, and international flights. But to my family, I was still just Ethan. I was still the quirky, struggling computer guy they politely tolerated and deeply pitted at Thanksgiving dinners. The tense weeks leading up to Julian's lavish wedding were an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare. My family's phone calls were like bizarre dispatches from an alternate reality where I was still a total failure. The most infuriating call came from my Aunt Evelyn. She was my mother's sister and the family's undisputed chief gossip and intelligence officer. She called me on a quiet Sunday morning, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and fake concern. She sang loudly into the phone, telling me in excruciating detail how the exotic floral arrangements alone for Victoria and Julian's wedding cost more than most people's luxury cars. She aggressively gushed over Julian's supposed massive success, his new corner office, and his astronomical salary. Then, with practice, precision, she slipped the knife in. She said, "It must be so incredibly hard for me, seeing my older brother completely conquer the world while I was still trying to get my little computer hobby off the ground in my apartment." Every single word she spoke was a perfectly crafted, highly intentional insult, wrapped tightly in a sugary coating of pity. I simply thanked her for her deep concern and hung up the phone. Then came Liam. Liam used to be a decent guy. He was a close friend from college who actually borrowed rent money from me back in the day when he was dead broke. But Liam eventually figured out that aggressively flattering Julian was a much faster way up the corporate ladder. He had abandoned our friendship and secure a job as Julian's glorified assistant at Blackwood Financial. Liam mailed me the formal wedding invitation with a handwritten sticky note attached. To the heavy cardstock, it said, "Ethan, try to dress nice, man. A lot of heavy hitters will be there. Don't embarrass him." The sheer blinding audacity of a guy who used to sleep on my dirty couch telling me how to dress for a networking event was almost comical. Julian's own phone call was exactly what I expected it to be. He called me from his office on a speakerphone, deliberately making sure I could hear the bustling, important sounds of corporate business happening in the background. He offered me some friendly advice. He told me to keep my mouth completely shut about my tech stuff at the reception because it came off as needy and desperate to successful people. He explicitly told me to stick to talking about the weather or sports, so I wouldn't accidentally drag his sterling reputation down in front of his bosses. I absorbed all the slights. I absorbed the endless condescension. I did not argue because they had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 8 grueling months quietly rewriting the entire script of their lives. The single phone call that changed the entire strategic landscape of my revenge came late on a Tuesday night. I was standing alone in the cavernous Nexus Tech boardroom, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering city skyline, meticulously reviewing the final financial blueprints for Project Nightingale. Nightingale was our highly classified internal code name for the complete hostile takeover of Blackwood Financial. We had spent months quietly buying up vulnerable shares through shell companies and securing disgruntled shareholder support. The final killing move was scheduled to execute on the Monday morning immediately following the wedding. Suddenly, my private encrypted cell phone rang. It was an unlisted number. Very few people had this number. I answered, and a gruff, incredibly impatient voice barked through the speaker. "Ethan Vance, this is Harrison Sterling." I physically froze in place. Harrison Sterling. He was Victoria's incredibly wealthy father. He was a ruthless titan of industry, a man who possessed massive commercial real estate holdings and a senior voting member on the board of directors at Blackwood Financial. My mind instantly went to red alert. I assumed he had somehow discovered the secret takeover bid and was calling to threaten me with a massive, crippling lawsuit to protect his future son-in-law. I kept my voice dead calm, masking my racing heart. "Mr. Sterling, this is a surprise," he told me to cut the crap immediately. He said he had been sitting on ruthless corporate boards longer than I had been alive, and he knew exactly what an executioner psalm sounded like when he heard it. He had seen the subtle market whispers of Project Nightingale. He knew my plan was bold, highly aggressive, and entirely likely to succeed. I said nothing, waiting for the heavy threat to drop, but the threat never came. Harrison Sterling told me the old guard at Blackwood Financial were proud, sentimental, outdated fools who would much rather go down with a sinking ship than admit they were financially bankrupt. He said he, on the exact other hand, was a cold pragmatist whose absolute only loyalty was to his own bottom line and his family's wealth. I asked him what his bottom line was telling him right now. His response completely shifted the earth beneath my feet. He told me his bottom line told him that his future son-in-law, Julian, was a charismatic, arrogant, utterly useless idiot who had been promoted far, far beyond his actual level of competence. He said Julian was a massive liability who spent significantly more time posing with his ridiculous Porsche than actually looking at crucial financial spreadsheets. He revealed that a huge portion of his family's inheritance and the college funds for his future grandchildren were deeply tied up in Blackwood stock that Julian was actively driving straight into the ground. Harrison did not want to stop my hostile takeover. He wanted to aggressively accelerate it. He told me he was fully aware of the ironclad prenuptial agreement protecting his daughters' assets. He said a messy, highly public divorce in a year, followed by a nasty custody battle and endless lawsuits over assets when Julian inevitably bankrupted himself would be a total public relations disaster for the sterling family brand. He wanted a quiet, ruthlessly managed transition under competent new ownership, my ownership. He told me to push the financial deal through fast. He told me the entire senior executive team, including the arrogant CEO, Richard Blackwood, would be at the wedding reception, fat, happy, and incredibly drunk on cheap champagne. Harrison basically handed me the keys to the entire kingdom. He told me to introduce myself to the board directly. At the reception, he wanted me to rattle their cages. He wanted me to let the bleeding sharks see exactly who was circling their yacht. When the line finally went dead, I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. The game had flipped entirely on its head. This was no longer just a hostile corporate takeover. It was a fully sanctioned execution, and I had the absolute tactical high ground. I immediately called Maya Lin into my office and told her we were moving the timeline up. I told her I was going to the wedding and I was going to burn their entire stage to the ground. The morning of the wedding was strangely, beautifully serene. The city outside my penthouse window was quiet, completely draped in the soft gray light of early dawn. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood looking out at the waking skyline. I knew with absolute certainty that across town, my parents' house was an absolute hive of frantic, highly controlled chaos. I could easily picture the stressed hairstylists, the panicked makeup artists, the endless screaming over misplaced binders, and my mother viciously barking orders at terrified catering staff. My own preparation was a quiet, intensely methodical ritual. I did not blast loud music to pump myself up. I moved with the cold, calculated precision of a trauma surgeon preparing for a highly complex life-saving operation. I had carefully laid out my suit the night before. It was a bespoke charcoal masterpiece cut perfectly from heavy English wool by an exclusive tailor in London. It did not have the shiny, cheap flash of the rented, ill-fitting tuxedos my brother and his loud groomsmen would be wearing. It was a suit designed specifically to convey absolute, unspoken authority. It was the heavy armor of a man who owned the entire room before he even walked through the door. After taking a long shower, I sat at my sleek desk and opened the massive Blackwood financial acquisition file one last time. I mentally rehearsed the key data points until they were burned into my memory. I memorized their abysmal, embarrassing revenue decline over the last 3 fiscal years. I looked at the grossly bloated executive salary structure that rewarded failure. I memorized the catastrophic performance numbers of the exact logistics division Julian was supposed to be expertly managing. I was not preparing for a joyful family reunion. I was preparing for a brutal, hostile shareholder meeting. Before I left the apartment, I opened a locked, heavily encrypted folder on my laptop. Inside was a single, high-resolution scan document. It was the email exchange from exactly 10 years ago. The email where I explicitly detailed the $50,000 loan to my mother. And her explicit, undeniable reply, "Thank you, honey. You are a lifesaver. Julian will pay you back with interest." It was not a notarized legal contract, but it was absolute, undeniable proof of their betrayal. It was the digital ghost of a broken promise. I saved a copy directly to the home screen of my phone, ready to be deployed. Finally, I picked up my grandfather's watch. I fastened the faded, heavily frayed leather strap to my wrist. The cool metal felt like a heavy anchor grounding me in reality, reminding me exactly why I was doing this. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I saw a man entirely forged in the blazing fire of his family's utter indifference, entirely ready to bring the heat right back to their front doorstep. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a secure text from my Lynn. The board has been officially notified of a pending transformative offer. The corporate rumor mill is fully ablaze. Your stage is set. I texted back. A single word. Showtime. I arrived at the sprawling Ashworth Manor just as the lavish cocktail hour was hitting its absolute peak. Instead of walking through the grand main entrance where my parents were, enthusiastically greeting guests and eagerly accepting thick envelopes of cash, I slipped in quietly through a side garden terrace. I wanted to carefully observe the battlefield before I actively stepped onto it. The garden was teeming with the absolute elite of the city's financial sector. There were women dripping in heavy diamonds and men holding expensive scotch loudly, complaining about capital gains taxes and real estate regulations. I grabbed a simple club soda with a lime from a